Free speech saves lives. Tonight's broadcast, I'm going to share some insights from last night's major event where over 20 speakers came together to discuss the impact of the suppression of free speech during the COVID chapter and how that suppression of free speech may have cost lives around the world. Hi, my name's Astin-Gregory. Welcome to the Elevate podcast. And last night, you could argue, was the biggest free speech event of the year. Our speakers gathered on Twitter Spaces. There's a new feature that's been rolled out which enables audio-based discussions and debates on any manner of topics. Now, speaking of free speech, now that Elon Musk has invested in the company, taken over the company and restored free speech, at least initially, and restored a lot of those who had lost their accounts during the course of the COVID chapter. Not all, of course, which I'll speak more about as we go through. What the long-term prognosis is for any platform like Twitter is still unknown, but certainly now it is a space where you can have a free and open discussion and have your views shared without fear of censorship. Now, this event last night was hosted by Neil Oliver and Nick Hudson from Panda. Nick, by the way, has still not had his account restored on Twitter. He shared his story last night about how he was deplatformed effectively from Twitter for retweeting someone else's tweet. It wasn't even something he had said himself. And the person who he had retweeted still has their account, which is quite peculiar. So Neil and Nick hosted the event with 4 different panels, which explored the impact of the erosion of free speech on politics, on science, on vaccines in particular, and on media. It was a fascinating discussion. As with any of these Twitter spaces, they do tend to go on for several hours, and last night was no exception. I think it was planned for 2 hours. It started at 8, and I was speaking at midnight last night. Went on for over 4 hours, but an incredible series of discussions, and the speakers included, it was a real exceptionally long list of speakers, a reunion, if you will. A lot of those of us who have worked together over the last couple of years came together last night. Jeffrey Tucker, Mark Chanzizi, David Thunder, Joel Smalley, Kat Lindley, Robert Malone, Ivor Cummins, Dr. Ryan Cole, Dr. Richard Urso, Jackie Stone, Tess Laurie, Bob Moran, Steve Kirsch. There's a whole range of speakers covering these key topics. And what I want to share with you tonight is some of my key takeaways from the discussion. I'll share some of my broader reflections on the impact of the erosion of free speech and give space for you to share your thoughts in the comments, because this is an important conversation. It's an important conversation about the state of our world. Our ability to communicate freely is a central tenet of a free, open, and democratic world. And we know over the last couple of years that it's been ruthlessly suppressed. And the discussion began last night with Nick Hudson from Panda pre-framing how the scale of censorship that is required in order to maintain a grand narrative is unprecedented. And we saw that, we saw that throughout the course of the COVID chapter. Any dissenting voice, anything that challenged the official authorities, the World Health Organization and other central bodies, anyone that challenged the official storyline, the official narratives were suppressed, deplatformed, censored, a whole manner of activities. And we saw this at a scale that we haven't witnessed really since the birth of the internet and the social platforms. We saw a relentless amount of censorship, and that censorship enabled this kind of grand narrative to propagate without really any strong challenge until the last year or so. And Nick went on to talk about how propaganda is the evil twin of censorship, and how propaganda, when it's used, creates the kind of environment where you don't actually need digital censorship. It creates the environment where one self-censors. And I experienced that firsthand myself, early stage in the pandemic. I remember, I looked at the data, I looked at the science from as early as January 2020, and most of you have heard my story about why that happened. But I remember putting up a series of 10 questions on Facebook, just questions, just asking questions. No, they weren't preloaded. They weren't assumptions. They weren't, stating facts or any argument. They were just merely questions. And just for asking questions at that time in March 2020, I was, met with these kind of vitriolic responses, all this aggression, people's emotions and fears played out right in front of my eyes. So I ended up deleting the post. I took it down, and I looked at the post recently. I kept the note. I saved it as a document on my laptop. And I read the questions, and they're all still sensible questions. I'd probably change one or two of them now based on my new understanding of the world, but I self-censored. I took that down because of the backlash. And then my next piece of observational content that I shared early again in the pandemic, I ended up doing the same thing. I thought it's not worth it. It's causing me more stress than it's worth. Now, fortunately, I broke through that and created over 500 pieces of content in the last couple of years, and just said, "Screw it, let's do it." No matter what the consequences, we've got to challenge these things. We've got to be able to speak freely. But nonetheless, I know I'm not limited. We know that many people have been silently watching on the sidelines, unable to have the courage to actually speak their minds about what's happening. So the conditions that were created through propaganda, through the fear, actually led to people self-censoring. So it didn't even need the relentless censorship of the big tech platforms. The conditions themselves created an environment where free speech did not flourish or prosper. So we really have to think about that. We really have to think about the social conditions, which is something that Mark Changzizi spoke about. He said the elephant in the room is the societal level forces that enable the top-down forces to function in the way that they did. These underlying conditions, which some of the things that Matthias Desmet has talked about, the free-floating anxiety, the loneliness and isolation that is felt within society, and various other factors that he speaks about within his work around mass formation. All these are latent within society. And Charles Eisenstein, he wasn't with us last night, but on our interview together on the Elevate podcast, stated how this table was already set for something like this to happen, and we can now see that. So the conditions create the situation where people actually do not freely speak. And we can look through history to see during other authoritarian and regimes or any tyranny, whereby great atrocities can occur, and people watch from the sidelines and they still don't speak their mind out of fear. So the propaganda element of what we witnessed in the last couple of years really exacerbated those latent social conditions and really created an environment where people self-censored and stayed silent, even if what they were witnessing they didn't disagree with. They were silenced, irrespective of the fact they had an experience like me, whereby they put something up and were met with a backlash. And those people who were met with backlashes, it was for some reason that became very common knowledge. So you could very viscerally see that actually, if you are going to challenge the knowledge, you're going to challenge the narrative. Rather, you're going to be on the receiving end of this hate. And most people live a simple life without having to worry about defending themselves to their friends and family. So this really to set the scene for the conversation was a really fascinating take from Nick. And Neil Oliver, the co-host, spoke about how, and by the way, I'm not going to go through the remarks from all 20 speakers. I'll be here all night. We were there for 4 hours last night. I'm not going to recount the event for you. You can still watch it. The recordings are on Twitter. I'll put the links in the comments. So if you want to tune in, you got some spare time, 4 hours of it, you can tune in. I have actually asked the event host if we can have Creative Commons public access to the recordings, and we can chop it up into individual segments. So watch out for that. We'll see if we can do that. We'll be able to edit it down to the different panels, and we'll put it on our audio podcast because it's an audio only discussion. Anyway, Neil Oliver said that the challenge is far bigger than COVID, and that we've been blind to this underlying reality, these underlying forces, these underlying trajectories that the world is on. Not everyone, of course, but certainly what's galvanized over the last couple of years, this movement that's emerged, challenging the narratives of COVID-19 and the various restrictions that followed. We can see that there is a wider mechanism, and that may, to the untrained mind, sound like a conspiracy. But the reality is there is corporate interests. There is a reason why many of these narratives unfolded in the way that they have. It doesn't take much of a depth or exploration to start to see how those pieces fit together. And as a result, Neil stated that the engine behind what has happened, the engine that functions behind everything, does not want us to speak freely or to talk with each other. And it's no surprises that things like lockdowns and social distancing actually prevented us from freely discussing and debating and having that kind of typical public square that one would have in different contexts, and even in informal settings like coffees with friends and dinners out, the ability to freely communicate over the table, eye to eye, was removed, as well as in the digital realm. And I thought that Jeffrey Tucker, who's the founder of Brownstone, the Brownstone Institute, he made a really interesting point. He asked the question in the follow-up to what Neil had said about this engine that's behind the machine. He wondered whether the censorship machinery was already in place pre-lockdowns. Were big tech ready for this? Had they been primed? Did this develop over time? Did it unfold? The self-censorship, as I mentioned, was already evident, but did big tech already have the mechanisms in place to start to shut down conversation, to deprioritize anything that goes against the narrative, to lower things in the algorithm, or to cancel individuals? Was that machinery already there? And we can look to some of the simulation exercises like Event 201. And, you can see from the discussion, we screened Event 201 into that, last year or the year before in full. So people could actually see the discussion of this simulation, this tabletop simulation exercise, where they actually went through how they would respond to a not COVID, that's a Freudian slip, a coronavirus outbreak. And what was stated quite clearly there is that the big tech would collaborate to ensure that the only information that gets through to people is official information from trusted sources. And lo and behold, the Trusted News Initiative emerged, and big tech acted in cahoots across a range of subjects, prioritizing the words and deeds of the World Health Organization and other national health bodies, the NHS, the CDC, etc. So it's quite clear that the ability for these platforms to censor already existed. Censorship is not exclusive to the COVID chapter. It clearly predates it. But the scale of which were the mechanisms in place in order to clamp down on free speech in such a way? That's a very interesting question to ponder. And we don't know with great certainty, but as I mentioned, the kind of simulation exercises show that at least the thinking was there around how big tech would collaborate in cahoots with governments and central organizations to throttle information that challenges public authority. Later in the panel, we heard from a range of different people looking at it from different angles. And David Thunder, who is someone who's been on our podcast 3 times, he's a political philosopher in many ways. He spoke about the concerns about how a dangerous precedent has been set for the foreseeable future by what we've witnessed in the last couple of years. And you can apply that to any of the measures, let alone the particular expression of the censorship that we're discussing here. But it does create a worrying condition. And as you can see already now, there are other social issues that are grand narratives, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the LGBT, Q plus communities, the kind of topical cultural conversations that we're having around world events and cultural issues, social challenges. There is a very tightly woven narrative that, again, is being protected, whether it's climate or anything else. Our ability to actually dissect and pull apart different storylines, different evidence, different conversational points is being throttled by these mainstream, I can call them mainstream now, these mainstream social platforms. And, I rather agree with David that precedent has been set, and it's one that we need to challenge. And, again, regardless of what you think about Elon Musk, the reality is that Elon has made probably the most expensive investment in free speech that human history has ever recorded. 44 billion or whatever he paid to enable free speech to occur. And, continually now releasing the Twitter files, which shows the collaboration that we're talking about here with governments, with central organizations. And I believe someone said the Fauci files are due today. We'll now see how big pharma and the scientific machine has interacted with social media. So there's growing evidence that means that what I'm saying here is far more than speculation and pontification on the issue. It's now being, trailed through the public domain, much to the silence of mainstream media, who have been complicit in this entire storyline. But we had various different speakers join us who were not only commenting on the state of the world in terms of censorship, but they're actually sharing their personal stories. Ivor Cummins, who I've got to know over the last couple of years, shared how that in September 2020, he created a video that went viral. It had 1.8 million views. It was actually featured in the New York Times. But it broke down many of the key narratives and actually showed evidence that vastly contradicted the official storylines and actually tore down some of the basis of what we were seeing in the mainstream media. And of course, having seen that video go viral, in the wake of that, it was taken down alongside, 12 to 14 other videos from his channels on YouTube. And he stated that this is clearly politically driven and not scientifically driven. This is a political choice because the science, in his view, was solid. And, he's very robust in his material. He was one of my go-to guys during the course of the last couple of years, very reasonable man. But that discussion around, is this politically driven, is an important point because which actually became a point of discussion within this particular panel, saying that we'd invested a lot of our time constantly, putting out counter evidence, sharing the latest research, and seeing that repeatedly censored and also, subject to ad hominem attacks, slander, all these different smears, people going for the character rather than the actual content, which really, to me, highlights the fact that this is a political problem. And actually, we need to perhaps think differently about our approach when addressing these issues. But Ivor Cummins shared his story. Mike Eden was present on the event. He shared his story about how he faced censorship and how he still faces censorship today. In fact, he believes his IP has been blocked. He can't even create a secondary account using fake names or anything like that. It's intense. There's this really intense takedown. Now, we then got to talk about the impact on science. And this is why I've titled tonight's session, Free Speech Saves Lives, to mirror the conversation we had last night. There was an entire panel discussion, which was pretty much dedicated with story after story of frontline medical practitioners, Dr. Richard Urso, Sabine Hazan, Dr. Pierre Corey, and others, Tess Laurie, who spoke about how they, in this emergency, were working on treatment protocols to actually save lives, to actually treat people who were suffering from this condition. And story after story about how their protocols, anything that was shared online, because of course, there they are thinking that they found something that could actually help humanity. They're seeing results in their own practice and they're taking it to the web to share and, almost expecting that they're going to not receive a fanfare, but, a celebration that there is hope here. The people who are losing their lives, the people who are suffering, there's treatments that could save lives. But what they all shared, blow by blow, is how each time they shared drug treatments for COVID-19, specifically around ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. I don't know if I can even say those words still. I'm broadcasting on Facebook and YouTube. I can say it on Twitter. If you're watching on Twitter, good to see you. If you're on the other platforms, you may see me disappear from your screens for using those words. And I'm serious. The first time I experienced censorship was as a result of sharing information about ivermectin. And it wasn't a sales pitch for ivermectin by any stretch. It was a clinical review of the data by Tess Laurie, and it got taken down, as did my conversation with Pierre Corey. But many of the doctors that were present last night shared how, they repeatedly got taken. Any evidence that they shared was taken down. And we're talking scientific evidence. We're talking published papers. We're talking journal, those that could get printed, which is another part of the story that I'll come to. But many of these doctors, and it was shocking to hear story after story of not only censorship online, censorship on social media, but within the academic circles. We heard stories of how by challenging the narratives, by presenting alternative information, evidence and protocols, drug treatments, presenting these within the academia, the scientific functions in the academic circles, this was all getting shut down, suppressed, ignored. And it was crazy to hear how even universities were not facilitating any viable discussion around possible treatments. And you've got to ask big questions, why that would happen. In this state, if it is a genuine emergency, wouldn't it make sense for your faculties to dedicate a portion of their resource to actually looking for possible treatments and preventions. You would surely think that's a necessary outlet. But of course, as we know, we now zoom out and we can look at, or zoom back in even, look at the funding sources of these scientific departments, these major institutions, and we can quite see it neatly wrapped up with Big Pharma. And, Big Pharma had a more profitable solution to, that's my view, to the problem that we were facing. Therefore, any of these potential drug treatments, regardless of their promise, regardless of their efficacy, were shut down. Well, the debate around these things is still being shut down today. And it's quite evident with this relentless fact checking, these Big Pharma sponsored fact checks and big tech sponsored fact checks. You have to see the conflicts of interest here. You weren't interested in finding any kind of truth. They were there in order to protect a narrative. You never saw a fact check go in a different direction. I mean, there's so much misinformation out there around COVID-19 vaccines from governments. I saw a video today circulating with Joe Biden saying, if you take these vaccines, and I might even get censored for saying what he said, which is how crazy this is. Do I need to quote YouTube? I'll quote I'll air quote for you. Take this. Biden saying, if you take these vaccines, you will not get COVID. It's on record. That's the beauty of the modern world. For all the flaws of the digital technology and the big tech that's caused a lot of this censorship problems, we have the receipts. This is all on public record, video after video. And you get people on social media saying no one ever said that. No one ever said it would prevent infections. It's like, ta-da, here's the repertoire. Here's the entire, not just articles, news clips, videos, entire, swathes of information that quite clearly shows that the government was spreading misinformation. And it was misinformation. It was actually disinformation, because if you actually look at the trials, it was very clear that they were never trialed on the endpoint of preventing infection. So it was misinformation or disinformation, more rightly, from the very beginning. But nonetheless, the fact checkers would uphold the grand narratives. They would never, and we still don't see it, even today, even with these grand, flawed narratives, we don't see any of the fact checkers jumping up and down, making a fuss about these official storylines that have been proven false time and time again. So yeah, it's absolutely crazy. The story around ivermectin I found fascinating, and there is lots of there's a whole conversation we could have around that, and I'm very mindful, having shared what I've just shared, whether we can go into that now. But Dr. Sabine Hazan is someone who is very experienced when it comes to clinical trials. She herself has conducted over 300 clinical trials. Her close family are all in the medical scientific industry. Her family together have conducted over 1,000 clinical trials within her family. And, she came up against all of these barriers to being able to actually even recruit people into these trials. She found all of these different probable treatments. She had all these different observations around the virus and how it was evolving. Yet the fact that she was looking for early intervention, drug trial possibilities, she was attacked in the media. It was slander. They threw the book at her, and you hear all of these stories. There's these credentialed scientists who are working night and day to actually save lives, to attempt to save lives. And their work was being, shot to pieces. And in fact, in most cases, it wasn't even their work being shot to pieces. It was these ad hominem smear attacks, which is absolutely ludicrous. And the conclusion for a lot of these scientists was that who has the money controls the science. And I think for those of us who have watched closely over the last couple of years, it's very hard to disagree with that statement. Now, I've mentioned some of these scientists and the kind of credentials they have. Joel Smalley was there. He's been on the Pandemic podcast. His interview with us was banned. We created a piece of content together looking at the impact on all-cause mortality following the vaccines. That was censored, of course. But he talked about the problem of credentialism. I've openly shared that some of the doctors there are highly credentialed, but Joel Smalley is highly qualified, and he has a lot of expertise, but he's not an epidemiologist. He's not from the fields that have been revered. And, people would challenge saying, well, you're not an epidemiologist, you're not an immunologist. And think about it for a minute. who in the general public even knew the term epidemiologist prior to COVID? It's not something you talk about every single day, but all of a sudden there's this societal expectation that anyone challenging the narrative has to be a doctor or a scientist or a lab coat or an epidemiologist or an immunologist or a virologist. There was this expectation that you would have to have these qualifications. Yet, how many of the politicians that were spouting out what they were spouting have the relevant qualifications to intervene in any form of health matter? And how many of these people working in these centralized health institutions actually have the relevant qualifications in the terms that are being used to critique what had been happening over the course of time? So Joel shared a different perspective on credentialism and how that was actually used as a force against people to try and suppress them from challenging the narratives and providing different evidence. Pierre Corey was there. I loved hearing from Pierre Corey. He's become one of my favorite people over the last 2 years. He shared how, at the beginning of the pandemic, he took it all very seriously. He was responsible for frontline critical care. He was worked for, I think responsible for some of the 60 to 80 frontline care workers. Immediately got to work thinking about how they can set up their hospitals to support. And, he took it very seriously initially. I'm not saying he hadn't took it seriously since. He's taken it serious all the way through. But I'm saying is he took the grand narrative seriously. He followed the protocols. But then, as a frontline clinician looking for different treatments, again, he was sat in his car on the radio, and he heard about how hydroxychloroquine was being suppressed. That was a flag to him. He was someone who mentioned about how he couldn't even discuss treatments within the University of Wisconsin. He left on a moral basis. There was no appetite for trialing drugs or even discussing preventative treatments. So he left and became a founding member of the Frontline Critical Care, the FLCCC, to look at all these different treatments. But there was story. Tess Laurie came up. There was story after story around treatments. And then, of course, we had the panel that I featured, which was around the media. And, I produced 500 pieces of content the last few years, but I've had censorship on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. It's been an incredibly challenging couple of years to work within the parameters that have been set. And we've worked really hard to do that. We've fact checked ourselves. We look at multiple pieces of evidence before broadcasting, particularly when we're looking at science, data, and medicine, etc. We worked incredibly hard to learn the guidelines. We wanted to find out how do we communicate, because once we reached several million views, we didn't want to lose our ability to reach people. Of course, starting from scratch is not easy, but that's what we had to do. Pandemic podcast in its first iteration, 5 million views on YouTube, gone, deplatformed for talking about vitamin C and ivermectin. And we're smart, we're not stupid. We didn't go on to any of these episodes saying, "Oh, just take vitamin C and you're all going to be all right." It's a wonder drug. We didn't say that about ivermectin or vitamin C. We treaded very carefully. We presented the evidence. We didn't present any conclusions. We said it's all subject to further investigation, but no, it contravened the authorities. And of course, since we've been censored from everything from the drugs to any critique of the vaccines, any critique of the lockdowns, the whole manner of suppression. I've only just come off a 30-day ban, but even now I'm still convinced I'm being shadow banned on Facebook. One of my channels, my page, is still got the red restricted warning on it. So, it's incredibly difficult to reach people with valid information. And Ivor Cummins, during his session, he spoke about how YouTube recently quietly dropped a few of their rules because they have been one of the most stringent. And apparently you can, I will test this, but apparently you can now question lockdown efficacy and vaccine efficacy. I can't believe they're allowing you to challenge the golden goose, but apparently so. But get this, you're not allowed to question the severity of COVID or compare it to influenza or any other coronavirus. You can't even compare it to another coronavirus. That's mad. Like for like, okay, I can understand you might have some challenges comparing apples and oranges, but apples with apples, come on. It's insane. What we've witnessed is insane, in my view. I've never seen anything or known anything like it. But it was a fascinating conversation. I strongly recommend, if you're not on Twitter, if you want to find a platform, a mainstream platform, it is the one platform you can now go to and have a open conversation. These spaces, audio-only spaces, conversations are fascinating. I'm sure there'll be lots more. I've been inspired by that. I'd like to host some conversations on there myself. But we do have to ask big questions of society right now. We have to ask, how do we protect free speech? We've got to think about, how do we not only protect free speech, but how do we instill the value? How do we begin to appreciate it? Because I was talking to a dear friend of mine today who said that, the liberal left, who have typically been bastions of free speech and free speech advocates, have become enemies of free speech in the recent years, particularly on the progressive side. It's mad. It's mad how, the cultural appreciation for free speech and its value has been constrained. But again, we have to look at the systemic and societal factors that have enabled that. We have to look at the corporate interests that have actually propagated that over time, how it's infiltrated, using what Nick said around the propaganda, the evil twin of censorship, how all of this interplay has resulted in what we've experienced in the last couple of years. So yeah, head over to Twitter. You can listen to the full discussion. Let me know your thoughts in the chat. Where do you think we are? Do we think we're on an upward turn? Is that with the investment into Twitter, will this create a spiral effect? An upward spiral of resurgence of free speech? Are we entering into new waters, or are we just entering into the calm before the storm, where Orwellian thought police really clamp down on our ability to communicate freely? Let me know in the comments what you think. Now, in order to counter some of this free speech challenges, we have invested in our own platform. We built the Elevate community, or the Elevate network, as we previously called it, whereby we can publish and converse freely without external algorithms, without censorship. So if you're not yet a member of our community, our network, our movement, we're challenging these issues. We've got big plans for 2023 about how we're going to start building solutions to some of the post-pandemic issues. If you'd like to support us and come and join us in our community, you can head over to weareelevate.org. We'll be publishing all of our content going forward, including our interviews pre-release inside the community, free from censorship. We can have fully open conversations, balanced discussions, so regardless of whether you agree with what I'm saying, we want to have a conversation where people are invited and open, free to discuss the issues in an open environment. So if you're not yet a member of our Elevate network, do come over to join us at weareelevate.org. And lastly, I just want to point out a couple of things that's happening this week. Tomorrow evening, if you live anywhere near the Peak District, I'm speaking at the Buxton Freedom Hub in Buxton at the old Coach House. Again, we've got the details inside the Elevate network. I'll put it in the comments. And then this weekend, we're hosting a systemic change workshop. It's called Trailblazing Systemic Change. We're working in partnership with Campfire Convention, who we partnered with last year to deliver the Camp Out 2022 event. We are working with Gillian Sadiq, who is our curator of the event. She's got an immense experience in the world of social and systemic change and a huge Rolodex of experts who she's put together for this workshop. Now, it's largely aimed at change makers and campaign organizations, but we really want to target concerned citizens, people like you and I who need to have their input in these conversations around social change, because otherwise we just end up the same as everyone else, making decisions for others. So, come and join us. You'll find out all the details at weareelevate.org/trailblazers. It's going to be a 2-day event, Saturday, Sunday, this weekend. Series of workshops, discussions, debates around how we can address the underlying causes of many of the systemic issues that we're seeing today. It's the first, I'm sure, of many workshops to come. It's going to be a fascinating experience. So if you're interested in being part of the conversation about how we create real lasting systemic change, not only in issues related to COVID, we've got speakers from all over the world who have concerns about a multitude of different issues, social, climate, everything. We've got a whole range of people who are looking at things from a different perspectives. And again, our goal is to build bridges, to work together and start to work out how we can actually challenge the systems of power that have been responsible for everything that we've just discussed over the last 30 minutes or so. So thanks for tuning in. Please do share this. Help us expand our reach once more, having been throttled for the last year or so by these major platforms, exactly as we've just described. And I'll see you again later on this week on the Elevate podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you again very soon.